For Found today on Tuesday, September 29, we're starting on page 239 on chapter 26. Why? Jonah whispered. But Jonah knew the answer. He didn't even have to think about it. Beware. They are coming back to get you. The words from the letter echoed in his mind, leaving room for nothing else but panic. Chip, he whispered in his friend's car. If they say, great news, we got an offer to give out free airplane rides this morning. Don't get on the plane. Do you hear me? Don't get on any plane. Okay, Chip said, puzzled. He apparently hadn't figured anything out, the way Catherine and Jonah had. He hadn't been able to hear their conversation. Jonah didn't have time to fill him in. He turned back to Catherine. Catherine, you've got to tell them you're not Daniela, he said. Maybe that will stop them. Maybe if they just realize she's still in Michigan or wherever. They just put me in the other group, Catherine said. I'm not leaving you and Chip. She crossed her arms stubbornly and jutted out her lower lip just like she always did any time she fought with Jonah. But today, Jonah loved her for it, even as he wondered, what if something happens to me and Catherine both? That would kill Mom and Dad. Besides, you need me around to figure things out, Catherine argued infuriatingly. You're not the only one with a brain, Jonah countered. I'm the only one whose brain isn't traumatized, Catherine said, looking at Chip, who just now seemed to be putting everything together. His face had gone pale, and he was mouthing the words, plane? Plane? Do you really think? At the front of the group, several steps up in the staircase, Mr. Hodge clapped his hands together. All right, group, let's get started. We're the lucky ones. We get to go outside first, while Carol's group is sitting in a classroom, he said. Doesn't that mean we'll get stuck in a classroom this afternoon? Someone asked. It was one of the kids with the skull sweatshirts. Jonah missed Mr. Hodge's answer because he was thinking, oh please, an ordinary classroom with some ordinary, dull voice drowning on, so the greatest danger is that I might fall asleep. Jonah knew he was in greater danger than that. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his system, his whole body on alert. But he didn't know what he was supposed to do with all the adrenaline. He didn't know exactly what the danger was. He didn't really believe they were going to be herded onto an airplane. But do they need an airplane to send us somewhere, sometime else? What if it's like what happened to Angela, where we take one step forward and suddenly we're gone? Catherine jabbed an elbow into his ribs. Jonah realized that he'd begun swinging his head from side to side, his arms tensed, his fists ready, like someone was looking for a fight. Don't act so weird, she whispered. People are starting to stare. Jonah dropped his fists and forced himself to concentrate on what Mr. Hodge was saying. Before I go on, I need to introduce Gary Payne, another caseworker who will be assisting me with your group today, he said. Gary, come on up here. A younger man, dressed more casually in a sweatshirt and jeans, jogged up the stairs to stand by Mr. Hodge. He was barely taller than Mr. Hodge, but he was much bulkier. Jonah could see bulging muscles where Gary had pushed up his sweatshirt sleeves. Muscles? Is that E? Jonah leaned over and whispered urgently to Catherine and Chip. Helplessly, they both shrugged. Who could tell? On the hike, I'll lead the way, and Gary will bring up the rear to make sure there aren't any stragglers, Mr. Hodge said, grinning to make it seem like a joke. Like, who would want to lag behind on such a beautiful day, on such a lovely hike? Mr. Hodge began explaining the point of the hike, something about fitting into nature, finding one's identity through connecting with one's environment. For the first part of the hike, I want you to walk in complete silence, to really concentrate on what you're seeing around you. Then we'll stop and chat about what we've discovered in the silence. We're not allowed to talk, Jonah thought, his panic spiking again. Not to each other, not to other kids. Let's head for the middle of the pack, Catherine whispered, so Gary and Mr. Hodge can't see us talking. Oh, that's right, break the rules. It was strange how much relief Jonah felt, realizing that was possible. Mr. Hodge jumped down from the stairs and began leading the group down a hallway and out a door at the back of the school. Jonah let about a dozen kids file out ahead of him. He could see them stretched across the yard in the sunshine, headed for the woods of the nature preserve. It was a cheerful scene, but Jonah got chills watching. It reminded him of something from when he was a little kid. The Pied Piper, he thought. He and Catherine had a book of fairy tales when they were little. She had loved it, but he had hated it, because of one illustration that frightened him, the one of the Pied Piper leading the children of Hamelin to their doom. In the picture, the children were skipping and laughing and dancing to the piper's tune, but Jonah knew what was going to happen to them. He couldn't stand for them to be so happy when they ought to be scared. Mr. Hodge isn't playing any music, Jonah reminded himself. He's not magical. He can't force us to do anything we don't want to do. And yet Jonah was following him, pushing his way out of the door. We've got to warn the other kids, Jonah murmured to Chip and Catherine. Catherine looked startled, but Chip nodded and fell back to talk to the boy behind them. I'm Chip Winston, he heard Chip say softly. I called you a few weeks ago. Have you gotten any more strange letters? No, that approach will take too long. What if they only had a few minutes? Jonah sped up and fell into step with the girl ahead of him. He didn't even take the time to glance at her name tag to see if she was on the survivors list or not. You can't trust Mr. Hodge or Gary, he muttered. Pass it on. She gave him an "are you crazy" look and pointedly did not step forward to talk to anyone else. Jonah sighed and stepped up to the next kid himself. You can't trust Mr. Hodge or Gary, he whispered quickly. We're in danger. Be careful. Jonah reached 3 more kids before he felt a hand on his shoulder, just as they were about to step into the woods. It was Gary, who'd rushed up from the end of the line. Didn't you hear the instructions? He hissed in Jonah's ear. This is the silent part of the walk. If you can't follow the directions, you'll have to stay at the back of the line with me. So they stood at the edge of the woods while all the other kids filed past. Catherine shot Jonah a white-faced, worried look as she walked by, but there was nothing she could do. Chip didn't even glance in Jonah's direction. Good, Jonah thought. Pretend you don't know me. Then they won't be watching you, and you can give the rest of the warnings. He could feel the weight of Gary's hand still on his shoulder, heavier than it should be, holding him in place. Finally, the last kid walked by, and Gary let go. Okay, your turn, Gary said quietly. But remember, no more talking. How could Jonah talk when Gary was right behind him, watching? Despairingly, Jonah trudged forward. He could see the other kids snaking along the trail ahead of him, going deeper and deeper into the woods. Jonah had managed to talk to only 5 of them. Even if Chip reached all the others, would they believe him? What could they do, anyhow? After about a mile, Jonah realized that Mr. Hodge was gathering everyone together at the front of the line. Circle up, he called out. He was standing on a rock now, so they could all see him. Jonah joined the back of the crowd and tried to inconspicuously angle himself away from Gary, toward Catherine and Chip. Gary didn't try to hold Jonah back, but Jonah could feel his eyes on him. Few people know this, but there's a rather extensive cave back there, right off the path, Mr. Hodge was saying. It's one of the best-kept secrets of Clarksville. It's usually off-limits to the public, but we've received special permission to take you all in. We'll talk about your identities in the cave. Did those words sound ominous to anyone else? Jonah looked around, but most of the kids just looked bored and distant, as if this was a particularly dull class at school. Mr. Hodge bent down, ready to scramble down from the rock, but then he straightened up again. Oh, I almost forgot, he said. There's a really interesting rock formation right as you enter the cave. I forget the exact scientific explanation, but there's something odd about the composition of the rock, so if you spread your hand out and touch the right spot, you can feel one patch of the stone that's about 15 degrees colder than the rest of the rock. It's very bizarre. I'll show you where to touch as we're going in. Then he hopped down from the rock and led them downhill, down a winding offshoot trail toward a crevice behind the rock. Touch right here, he instructed the first boy behind him, a gangling kid who kept tripping over his own feet. Mr. Hodge pointed to an outcropping along a towering stone wall. Spread your fingers out. Feel it? Yeah, the boy said, sounding surprised. Now you go on through there, and you can sit on one of the benches at the back of the cave, Mr. Hodge said. Next. Jonah watched a girl repeat the same process. After barely a second with her hand against the wall, she jerked back. Ow! Oh, you couldn't have felt it that quickly, Mr. Hodge said. It doesn't hurt. Here, I'll show you. He took her hand and pressed it against the rock once more. See? Mr. Hodge said. Sure, the girl said, but Jonah had the impression that she was just trying to get away. She followed the gangly boy into the cave. Jonah watched the next few kids, watched as Mr. Hodge seemed so determined that each kid touched the rock, that each hand lingered on the rock for at least a couple of seconds. It reminded him of something from a movie, a scene he couldn't quite remember. It was a movie he'd watched at school, in science, the one that a horrible epidemic, maybe? Oh yeah, when the scientists went into their laboratories where all the deadly viruses were kept, they'd have to place their hands on a scanner to get in, to prove who they really were. There couldn't be any dangerous viruses in the cave, could there? Not with it hanging open, the air circulating freely. Jonah saw his mistake. "Catherine," he spoke softly, through gritted teeth, because Mr. Hodge was looking back at him, looking at all the kids coming down the hill. Catherine turned her head. Maybe it would just look as if she'd heard an unusual bird call and was trying to listen more closely. Jonah pretended to trip, stumbling against Catherine's back. "That's a hand scanner," he hissed in her ear. "Like fingerprinting. They're checking our identities, making sure we really are babies from the plane, I bet. Whatever you do, don't touch the rock. Just pretend." He watched Mr. Hodge pressing another kid's hand against the rock, forcing the kid's palm flat against the stone. Jonah changed his mind. "No," he told Catherine. "Run! Run back to Mom and Dad. Tell them we're in danger. Tell them to come back and save us." Catherine shook her head, nervous red spots standing out on her pale face. "What could they say that they'd believe? What could I say that they'd believe?" she whispered. "No, I'm staying with you." Jonah thought about grabbing his sister, holding her back, dragging her away to Mom and Dad safely, or just bolting himself. The muscles in the backs of his legs tingled, wanting to take off, but all screaming, "Run!" All the adrenaline in his body seemed to have pooled there. It was like the moment in a basketball game when every cell in his body seemed to know, time for your breakaway, go now. But what about all these other kids, the ones he and Chip had never gotten the chance to warn? The ones stepping so trustingly into the cave. The ones marveling so stupidly to Mr. Hodge, "Oh, you're right, it is cold." The ones who were actually going. Giggling. How could he leave them behind? The kids in front of him kept stepping onto the rock, then into the cave. The kids behind him pressed forward, trapping him and Catherine and Chip between them, and the stone, the rock, and the cave. Even if Jonah decided to run now, he couldn't. A girl in front of Jonah moved up to the stone wall. It was Andrea Crowell. Jonah recognized the braids from behind. She pressed her hand firmly against the rock, tilted her head to the side, deliberating. She turned to Mr. Hodge. "Does it have something to do with the oxidation levels?" she asked. Behind Andrea, Catherine held her hand toward the wall. Only Jonah was in a position to see that she didn't actually touch it, that she kept it a millimeter of air between her fingertips and the rock. She stood like that for a long time, then slipped past Andrea into the cave while Mr. Hodge was explaining to Andrea, "I don't know, I'm not a scientist. I heard the explanation, and it might be something about, what did you call it? Oops, hold on there, young lady. Did you touch the rock?" He was talking to Catherine now. He'd seen her trying to slip past. "She did. She took forever," Jonah complained. "Isn't it my turn now?" Quickly, probably hoping that nobody would notice, Mr. Hodge looked back toward Gary, who was watching from the end of the line. Gary gave a small nod, and Mr. Hodge let Catherine pass. Jonah stepped up onto the rock. His knees were trembling now. All the adrenaline seemed to have drained away. Had he just saved his sister, or doomed her? Chapter 27. They were all in the cave now, lined up on 4 rows of benches in a surprisingly large open rock room. One dim light bulb glowed overhead, casting ghostly shadows on everyone's face. Mr. Hodge had handed off feel the rock duties to Gary right after Chip entered the cave, so they hadn't had a chance to whisper to any of the other kids. Jonah was feeling jumpy again. He'd picked the seat closest to the exit, and he had a plan. If anything happened, a strange odor arising out of the deeper part of the cave he couldn't see into, any sound of an airplane, anyone showing up with ray guns or futuristic sunglasses, he'd grab Catherine and Chip and take off running. He'd go for help. Nothing could happen as long as he sat close to the doorway out. He was sure of it. From his vantage point, Jonah could see Gary standing by the mysterious spot on the rock wall outside. Gary touched the rock with one finger, then stood there staring, his eyes narrowed, concentrating. Then he touched the rock again, a quick brush of his forefinger. He turned and walked into the cave. "Is that everyone?" Mr. Hodge asked. "All good," Gary said, which was a strange answer. "Very well then," Mr. Hodge said, smiling. Gary nodded. Jonah heard the noise first, the sound of grinding that seemed to be coming from the other side of the rock wall, or maybe inside the rock wall. He peered out through the entryway, blinking at the sunshine that filtered down through the trees, and then the sunlight seemed to narrow, to dim. The entryway was closing. "No!" Jonah screamed. He threw himself toward the opening, toward the last rays of sunlight. The opening was only 5 steps away, maybe 6, and Jonah stretched out his legs, sprinting like he'd never sprinted before. In a second, his right foot would be out in the sunlight. He'd slip through. Something slammed into him from the side, knocking him to the rock floor. It was like being tackled in a football. This is why he'd never liked football, without any pads or helmet. And it was like he was playing on a stone field. And, oh yeah, like his tackler had muscles of stone, as Gary seemed to. The sunlight disappeared. "Are you an idiot?" Gary demanded from above him. "You could have been crushed in that door. Killed." "Caves don't have doors," Jonah muttered back, though his jaw felt broken, smashed against the rock. "This one does. It's been modified," Gary said. "They want to use it for meetings." And it was so strange that Jonah and Gary could have that conversation, while behind them the other kids were gasping and shrieking. Jonah could especially hear Catherine screaming, "Jonah! Oh, Jonah! Are you okay?" Oh, she was screaming it directly into his ear because she was sprawled on the ground beside him. Gary was scrambling up. "He's fine," he called out. "He just panicked. I guess we should have warned you that we were closing the door, so we could have some privacy." "You have to open it," Jonah said, raising his face from the ground. I'm claustrophobic." He grinned, amazed at his own quick thinking. He thought maybe he should have acted a little wacko, so everyone would believe that he'd been freaked out by the notion of being closed in, cut off from the outside world. He stood up. All the other kids were staring at him, their eyes bugging out. Oh, right. They already thought he was wacko. "I mean it," Jonah demanded. It was a relief to let all his panic come through his voice, to sound as scared as he felt. "Open the door. You've got to." His voice cracked. Maybe, on top of everything else, he truly was claustrophobic. The walls seemed closer together than they'd been before. The air seemed to be running out. Now, Gary said, clamping his hand down on Jonah's shoulder once more. "Calm down. If this really is a problem for you, I can take you out the back entrance so you don't ruin this workshop for everyone else." Jonah's eyes met Catherine's. She was still crouched below him. He wanted to ask her advice, work out some plans. If Jonah went off with Gary, could Catherine and Chip and maybe some of the other kids overpower Mr. Hodge? Would they know how to do that? Or was Mr. Hodge already too suspicious of Catherine and Chip because he'd seen them with Jonah? Anyhow, was Gary even telling the truth about a back entrance? All Jonah could picture was himself bound and gagged and hidden at the back of the cave, helpless, while all the other kids were taken away. Jonah took a deep breath, ready to say, "No, that's all right. I feel better now. I can stay." Then suddenly Gary's hand was jerking him backward, pulling him toward the ground again. Jonah's shoulder slammed into the rock even harder than before. "What'd you do that for?" Jonah started to ask, but Gary had already let go and was rolling away from Jonah. Jonah raised his head. Now he could see what had happened. Gary hadn't meant to pull Jonah down. Jonah was just collateral damage, falling with Gary when somebody else knocked Gary down. Now Gary and the other man were wrestling on the ground, first one rolling to the top, then the other. The other man was also wearing jeans and a sweatshirt and hiking boots. He was... "JB!" Catherine shrieked. "You came back!" Jonah felt the relief flowing through him. He relaxed against the stone floor, letting go of all of his fears. JB had protected them before, and he'd protect them now. Jonah didn't have to worry about what to do, how to save the other kids. JB would save them all. Except JB was getting his head pounded onto the stone floor. It'd been a while since the last time JB had rolled over the top of Gary, the last time he'd seemed to be dominating this fight. Jonah jumped up. "Catherine," he screamed, "JB's going to lose if we don't help him." Jonah lunged at the struggling men. He grabbed Gary's arm, his thick as a tree stump arm, with biceps as distinct as rope, and by bracing his feet against the ground, Jonah managed to keep Gary from punching JB again. No, scratch that. Gary's arm continued forward. Jonah had managed only to keep Gary from punching JB quite so hard. "Chip!" Jonah screamed. "Help!" Jonah glanced up to see that Chip and Catherine and even some of the other kids were rushing toward him. Catherine, with a girl's sense of fighting, went straight for the hair, jerking Gary's hair back by entwining her fingers right down to the roots. Jonah had to admit, it seemed to be working. Chip and 2 or 3 of the other boys were pushing at Gary's chest, trying to shove him away from JB, while a few girls tugged JB in the other direction. The other kids stood by in shock, their faces contorted into masks of dismay and disbelief. "Is this the role-playing part of the seminar?" he heard one girl ask hesitantly. Are we supposed to do something? It's not! Jonah started to scream at her, but then he decided he didn't have time to explain. Help us! The girl began to crouch down, but it was too late. Seconds later, Jonah heard the gunshot. That's the end of chapter 27.